So one of the questions that I seem to be getting asked a lot with regard to this Fit Cycles steel custom bike is, why did I choose rim brakes instead of disc brakes? Disc brakes have improved drastically over the past few years, and there's a number of really good disc brake options on the market. And it seems like the industry is definitely going more towards disc brakes and less emphasis is being put on rim brakes. So why in 2018, when I had this bike design, why did I decide to go with rim brakes? So today's video, I'd like to get into that discussion and talk a little bit about why I like rim brakes and why I specifically chose them for this particular bike build. When I was choosing between rim brakes and disc brakes, there were 4 different features that I needed to consider: frame weight, vertical compliance, rear hub spacing, maintenance and durability, and the last thing, which is number 5, is aesthetics. But I put that as number 5 because I don't think aesthetics is necessarily a good reason to choose one brake over another. So what I'd like to do next is talk about each one of these features separately. So let's talk about the first feature, and that is frame weight. So steel, unlike carbon, is a very dense material, and so it's very heavy. And in order to make a steel bike light, you have to use thin tubing. So when I first talked to John about fork options, when we looked at disc brakes, the fork for a disc brake bike would be about 1 pound heavier. So a disc brake bike would need a heavier fork in order for it to be strong enough to handle the extra forces of the disc brake force acting on the fork blade. If you look at a disc brake, it's acting on one side of the fork, but both sides of the fork have to be made using the same tubing. To try to keep this bike as light and lively as possible, to give it a road bike feel but with larger tires, a thin tubed steel bike that has a thin fork will ride a lot differently than a stiffer frame bike would with disc brakes. Okay, well, let's talk about the next feature that I considered when I was building this bike, and that is frame compliance, or frame stiffness as it's often called. When I was considering this frame, what I really wanted was a nice flexible frame that would roll smoothly over uneven surfaces. And I was afraid that if I had disc brakes, that the frame might become too stiff and not feel as light and lively as it would if I had used the thinner tubing for rim brakes. And I'm happy to report that this bike does feel incredibly smooth on rough surfaces, even with 48mm tires, which are these days, I guess, considered kind of medium in terms of width. They're wider on the road end, but narrow on the off-road end. They're still fairly fast on road, but also fast on gravel roads such as this one. Another important feature that I don't think is talked a lot about when it comes to frame stiffness is handling. With a bike that is somewhat flexible, I've noticed that the ability to corner is better. It stays more planted on the ground, especially even on an asphalt road. I found that with the wider tires and the flexible frame, that the handling and the cornering feels very good. It tracks the corners really well. It also feels like the tires stay in good contact with the pavement. Now, I think some of that, of course, is the wider tires, but also I think it has something to do with the flexibility built into the frame. The next topic we need to cover is frame clearances. But before we do, I want to skip ahead and talk a little bit about maintenance and reliability. Then we'll come back to talking about clearances after that. So one of the things that really drove this decision was reliability and maintenance. Rim brakes are very simple. They use a pad, a cable, and a brake lever. The calipers are very simple. So there's really not a lot that can go wrong on you when you're out touring or riding in a remote area. And in all the years that I've been riding bikes with rim brakes, I've never had a mechanical problem that prevented me from getting home or stopping the bike or whatever the case is. Now, disc brakes have come a long way over the last few years. They've become much more reliable. And so I think if you were purely basing your decision on reliability, you would be hard pressed to choose one over the other. So with that said, I think disc brakes are a perfectly viable option. I think they're very reliable and they are very durable as well. Rim brakes, for the kinds of rides that I do, I've favored them because I'm able to look down and see if the pads are rubbing. I know if something is amiss just by a quick glance. The downside with the disc brake is that the caliper is down at the hub, and the spacing between the pads and the rotors is very close, so it's hard to tell if things are rubbing. I've been on rides with others who have had to stop and check to see if their wheels are rubbing because they feel like something's wrong with the bike. And I don't have to do that with rim brakes. I can just ride along and I know if things are set correctly or not. So for simplicity's sake and just for general maintenance, I find rim brakes to be really, really easy to deal with. So let's dive into the next feature, which is clearances at the rear triangle. Now what I have is, with me, I have Miss Cool's bike. This is very similar to my bike in that it is a steel frame bike. It has a level top tube. It has very similar geometry, but the main difference being that it has disc brakes. So as you can see just by looking at it, the fork is a little bit beefier looking. It has this extra bracket in order to support the front brake caliper. It has on the back is the extra bracket down here on the chainstay for the rear disc caliper. With this bike, we have a rear spacing of 130 millimeters, and on this bike we have a spacing of 135 millimeters. When you have a disc brake bike, you need the extra space on the rear to fit the extra width of the brake caliper. So by doing that, you end up having to shape the chainstays a little bit differently in order to have clearance from the crank when the bike is pedaling past the rear stay. Also, you'll note that as the spacing gets wider in the rear, the chance of heel strike increases, which is why you see a lot of bikes with disc brakes going with wider and wider cranks. So with a road bike geometry, you're able to use narrower cranks with less chance of striking the rear derailleur or the rear chainstay. To summarize this video, when I was deciding between rim brakes or disc brakes, I tried to think of the bike as a whole, made up of individual parts all working together to provide the most optimal ride for the types of conditions that I ride in. And I think I achieved that. There are certainly trade-offs to rim brakes, and there are certainly things that disc brakes would offer to this bike that rim brakes can't offer. But in general, I'm pleased with the result. I find that this bike rides really, really well. I like how it handles on road. I like the way it handles off-road as well. It's certainly not a mountain bike, but it does do well in conditions where you might find yourself wanting to take the road off the highway. I'm rambling. I should conclude this video now. I am the king of rambling, so I think I'll conclude it there. But I will say, if you're in the market for different kinds of... So I will conclude by saying, when you're in the market, if you're in the market... Should I tell people if they're in the market?
Or you could just say, I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said about brakes, so if you want to add to the conversation.
Oh, yeah, there we go. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could talk about rim brakes and disc brakes. So if you have something in mind, feel free to leave that in the comments section, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.